The history of water. Why drinking water used to be dangerous. The morning is already warm, but the smell arrives before the sun does. It hangs in the narrow streets of Soho like a living thing, thick with horse manure, coal smoke, rotting vegetables, and something far worse. Housewives crack open their windows only long enough to empty chamber pots into the gutter before slamming them shut again. Shopkeepers sprinkle vinegar outside their doors, hoping its sharp scent will overpower the stench drifting from overflowing cesspits. A line has already formed around the public water pump on Broad Street. A young mother steps forward, cradling a bucket in one hand and her feverish daughter in the other. The child hasn't kept food down for 2 days. Her lips are cracked. Her breathing is shallow. Water, the mother believes, is the only thing that might save her. She lowers the iron handle. Cold, crystal clear water gushes into the bucket. It looks perfect. No strange color, no foul taste. No visible sign of danger. She carries it home. By sunset, the little girl is dead. By the end of the week, more than 500 people living within a few hundred yards of that single pump will be dead as well. Entire families will disappear behind locked doors. Streets that echoed with children only days earlier will fall eerily silent, broken only by the rumble of carts carrying away the dead before sunrise. No one can explain why. Some blame the foul smell, others blame divine punishment. Many simply accept that death has come, as it always does. Yet hidden inside that perfectly clear water is an enemy so small that no human alive can see it. An invisible killer that has followed our species since the first cities rose from riverbanks thousands of years ago. Today, pouring a glass of water feels almost automatic. But for most of human history, the act of taking a single drink was a gamble, one that could quietly decide whether you would live long enough to see another sunrise. And the most dangerous part was this: the water almost always looked perfectly safe. There is perhaps no substance on Earth more closely associated with life than water. Every cell in your body depends on it. Every civilization in history was built beside it. We instinctively reach for it when we're thirsty, sick, exhausted, or frightened. If someone offered you a glass of clear, cold water today, you would almost certainly drink it without hesitation. That simple act feels so ordinary that it's easy to forget how extraordinary it really is. Because for almost all of human history, the safest-looking water was often the most dangerous. Not because people were careless, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they had no way of seeing what was actually killing them. For thousands of years, humanity judged water the only way it could, by sight, smell, and taste. If it looked clear, smelled fresh, and tasted clean, it was considered pure. Rivers flowing from distant mountains seemed like gifts from heaven. Crystal clear wells were praised in poems, blessed by priests, and fought over by kingdoms. Entire religions treated water as a symbol of cleansing, rebirth, and divine favor. Ironically, those beliefs were not entirely wrong. Water did give life. It simply carried death at the same time. The greatest killers in history rarely marched under banners or arrived with armies. They traveled silently inside cups, buckets, wells, and rivers. Cholera, typhoid fever, dysentery, countless intestinal diseases whose names ancient people never knew, claimed far more lives than many famous wars. Yet for centuries, almost no one suspected the water itself. Instead, people blamed poisonous air drifting through city streets. They blamed curses, bad luck, angry gods, unusual weather, eclipses, even the alignment of the stars. Doctors carried fragrant herbs to protect themselves from disease. Wealthy families burned incense to cleanse their homes. Entire cities filled their streets with smoke, believing foul odors, not contaminated water, were the true enemy. The tragedy was almost unbearable. The very thing people drank to stay alive often became the reason they died. And the cruelest twist of all was that the danger remained completely invisible. You could boil soup over it, baptize a child in it, brew beer with it, or offer it to someone you loved, never realizing it contained millions of microscopic organisms waiting to invade the human body. Humanity did not spend thousands of years learning how to find water. It spent thousands more learning a far more difficult lesson: how to know when water could no longer be trusted. That lesson would reshape cities, overthrow centuries of medical belief, and ultimately become one of the greatest public health revolutions in human history. Long before there were kingdoms, temples, or written languages, there was a simple rule that determined where humans could live. Find water, stay alive. Miss it, and nothing else mattered. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors followed rivers the way later generations would follow roads. Streams became natural highways across unfamiliar landscapes, guiding hunters toward migrating animals and gathering places rich with edible plants. Water was more than something to drink. It was the invisible map that shaped the earliest human journeys. Archaeologists have found some of humanity's oldest settlements clustered around reliable fresh water sources, from the shores of ancient African lakes to the fertile valleys of the Near East. These weren't accidents. Water offered fish, attracted game, nourished vegetation, and made survival possible in ways no dry landscape ever could. Then, around 12,000 years ago, everything changed. Instead of following rivers, people began settling beside them. Agriculture transformed water from a daily necessity into the foundation of civilization itself. Along the Nile, predictable floods covered the land with fertile black silt every year, allowing Egyptian farmers to harvest grain on a scale the world had never seen. In Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates became the lifeblood of cities like Ur and Babylon, where elaborate irrigation canals carried water into fields that otherwise would have been barren. Farther east, the Indus Valley civilization engineered remarkably sophisticated drainage systems nearly 5,000 years ago. At Mohenjo-Daro, archaeologists uncovered brick-lined wells, covered sewers, and household bathing areas that suggest an astonishing concern for water management. Some homes even had private bathrooms connected to public drains, an achievement that many European cities would not match for thousands of years. In ancient China, the Yellow River brought both prosperity and disaster. Its fertile floodplains fed millions, but its unpredictable floods earned it a terrifying nickname: the River of Sorrow. Again and again, civilizations discovered the same truth. The greatest source of life could also become the greatest source of destruction. Yet, despite floods, droughts, and seasonal disasters, one danger remained almost completely hidden. People understood that stagnant marshes smelled unpleasant. They knew muddy water tasted worse than clear spring water. But no one imagined that a sparkling mountain stream could still carry disease. To ancient eyes, clear water meant clean water. It was an assumption so reasonable that almost every civilization accepted it without question. Religion reinforced the belief. Water became sacred across cultures. Egyptians associated the Nile with divine order. Hindu traditions honored rivers as living goddesses, capable of washing away spiritual impurity. Jewish purification rituals depended upon clean, flowing water. Later, Christianity would make water the central symbol of baptism, rebirth, and salvation. In nearly every civilization, water represented purity. The irony is difficult to overstate. Humanity built its first cities because of water. It blessed newborn children with water. It prayed beside water. It buried its dead near water. It trusted water completely. And yet, with every growing village, every expanding irrigation canal, and every crowded settlement built along a riverbank, people were unknowingly creating the conditions for a catastrophe that would take thousands of years to understand. Because the moment humans stopped moving, their water stopped staying clean. The first cities did not collapse because they ran out of water. They became dangerous because they had too much of it. As villages grew into towns and towns into crowded cities, humanity encountered a problem no hunter-gatherer had ever faced: waste. For thousands of years, human populations had been small enough that nature quietly absorbed what people left behind. A stream contaminated by a few families could cleanse itself over time. A seasonal camp abandoned after a few months allowed the land to recover. Cities changed the equation. Suddenly, tens of thousands of people lived within the same walls, sharing the same rivers, the same wells, and often the same sources of drinking water. Every meal, every bath, every animal, every workshop, and every household produced waste. Almost none of it disappeared. In ancient Rome, visitors marveled at one of the greatest engineering achievements the world had ever seen: aqueducts. Beginning in the 4th century BC, Roman engineers built hundreds of miles of stone channels that carried fresh water from distant hills into cities. Gravity alone powered the entire system. Some aqueducts crossed vast valleys on towering arches that still stand today, a testament to Roman ingenuity. To those who saw them, they seemed almost miraculous. The city of Rome eventually received hundreds of millions of liters of fresh water every day, feeding public fountains, bathhouses, gardens, and private homes of the wealthy. Running water became a symbol of civilization itself. Yet beneath this remarkable achievement lay a growing contradiction. Bringing clean water into a city was only half the problem. Getting dirty water out proved far more difficult. The Romans did build sewers, most famously the Cloaca Maxima, an enormous drainage tunnel originally constructed to drain marshland before gradually becoming one of history's earliest urban sewer systems. It carried rainwater, street runoff, and much of the city's waste toward the Tiber River. But the river itself remained central to everyday life. People washed clothes in it, animals drank from it, boats carried food along it, children played beside it, and countless families collected its water downstream. The farther cities expanded, the more impossible it became to separate drinking water from human waste. The problem was not unique to Rome. Across medieval Europe, narrow streets often doubled as open drains. Chamber pots were emptied from upstairs windows with little warning beyond a shouted cry. Rain washed refuse through winding alleys until it settled in rivers and shallow wells. Livestock wandered freely among people, adding their own waste to an already contaminated environment. To modernize, these cities appear unimaginably filthy. But to the people who lived there, the greatest threat was not what they could see. It was what they couldn't. Most physicians still believed disease traveled through miasma, poisonous air created by foul smells and decaying matter. The theory seemed logical. Wherever epidemics appeared, terrible odors usually surrounded them. Swamps smelled bad. Open sewers smelled worse. The richer the smell, the greater the danger seemed. The conclusion felt obvious. Bad air caused disease. Few stopped to ask whether the smell and the sickness might share the same source: instead of one causing the other. This misunderstanding shaped public health for nearly 2,000 years. Cities spent enormous effort trying to purify the air. Streets were burned with fragrant herbs, churches filled with incense. Wealthy families carried pomanders packed with spices and flowers, believing pleasant aromas formed an invisible shield against illness. Meanwhile, the real killer continued flowing silently beneath bridges, filling buckets, wells, and household jugs every single day. Humanity had mastered the art of transporting water across continents, but it still had no idea how to keep that water alive. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain was the richest industrial nation on Earth. Its factories produced iron, textiles, steam engines, and machines that transformed the modern world. Railways stitched together distant cities. Coal fueled an economic revolution unlike anything humanity had ever witnessed. Yet beneath this remarkable progress, another force was spreading just as rapidly: disease. London had become the largest city on the planet, its population swelling past 2 million people. Every week, thousands more arrived seeking work. Houses were divided into cramped rooms. Entire families squeezed into damp basements. Wells stood only a few yards from overflowing cesspits, while raw sewage flowed directly into the River Thames, the same river that supplied drinking water to large parts of the city. It was a disaster hiding in plain sight. Then came cholera. The disease arrived in Britain in the early 1830s after devastating parts of Asia and Europe. It struck with terrifying speed. A healthy person could wake feeling perfectly normal and be dead before nightfall. The first symptoms seemed almost ordinary: a stomachache, a little nausea. Then came relentless vomiting and violent diarrhea. Victims lost fluids faster than they could replace them. Their skin turned cold and bluish. Their eyes sank deep into their faces. Muscles cramped so violently that fingers twisted into permanent knots. Within hours, the human body began collapsing from dehydration. To witnesses, it looked as though life itself had been drained away. Doctors were powerless. Some prescribed bloodletting, others recommended opium, hot baths, mustard plasters, mercury, brandy. None of it worked. The official explanation remained the same: bad air. The poorer the neighborhood smelled, the more convinced authorities became that poisonous vapors were responsible. Entire districts were fumigated. Bonfires burned through the night. Barrels of tar were set alight in the streets, filling neighborhoods with thick smoke intended to purify the atmosphere. The smell changed. The death toll did not. Then, in late August 1854, cholera returned to London's Soho district with astonishing violence. Within just a few days, hundreds of people fell ill. Families who had shared breakfast together were burying loved ones before the week ended. Shops closed without warning because every employee was sick. Neighbors stopped visiting one another, terrified that simply breathing the same air might condemn them as well. Panic spread faster than the disease itself. Among the physicians watching the outbreak unfold was a quiet doctor named John Snow. Snow had spent years questioning the accepted wisdom of his profession. He was not convinced that foul-smelling air could explain what he observed. If miasma truly caused cholera, why did some people living in the same neighborhood survive while others died? Why were certain buildings devastated while nearby streets escaped almost untouched? He suspected something far less obvious: water. It was a radical idea. Without microscopes capable of revealing bacteria, Snow could not point to the invisible organism responsible. Instead, he relied on something far more powerful: evidence. Rather than accepting assumptions, He began knocking on doors. He interviewed grieving families. He recorded addresses. He asked where they collected their drinking water. Patient by patient, house by house, a pattern slowly emerged. Nearly every victim had one thing in common. They had drawn water from the public pump on Broad Street. Snow transformed his observations into one of history's most famous maps. Instead of showing roads or buildings, he marked every cholera death with a small black bar. The result was impossible to ignore. The bars clustered tightly around a single location, the Broad Street pump. Yet even this evidence met fierce resistance. Many officials refused to believe that perfectly clear water could carry disease. The idea contradicted centuries of accepted medical theory. How could something invisible be more dangerous than the overwhelming stench filling London's streets? Snow pressed on. He discovered one remarkable exception. Workers at a nearby brewery had suffered almost no cholera deaths. At first, this seemed to undermine his theory. Instead, it strengthened it. The workers rarely drank water. They drank beer. Because the brewing process required boiling water before fermentation, they had unknowingly avoided the contaminated pump. At a nearby workhouse housing more than 500 residents, another mystery emerged. Despite sitting close to the center of the outbreak, relatively few people became ill. Again, the explanation lay not in the air, but in the water. The institution had its own private well. On September 8, 1854, local officials finally agreed to a simple experiment. The handle of the Broad Street pump was removed. Residents could no longer draw water from it. Almost immediately, the outbreak began to fade. Today, historians recognize that the epidemic was already slowing by the time the handle came off, and the action alone did not end the outbreak. But that was never the true significance of John Snow's investigation. For the first time, someone had demonstrated that disease could spread through contaminated water rather than poisonous air. Years later, investigators discovered the likely source. A leaking cesspit only a few feet from the well had allowed sewage from a cholera-infected infant to seep into the groundwater beneath the pump. The water had remained cold, clear, refreshing. It looked exactly as safe as the mother in Soho believed it was when she filled her bucket. It was the perfect disguise for a killer no human eye could see. The invisible enemy had always been there. Humanity had simply spent thousands of years looking in the wrong direction. History often remembers the men who solved great problems. It remembers the engineers who built aqueducts, the scientists who discovered bacteria, the politicians who approved new sewer systems. But it rarely remembers the people who paid the price while the world was still searching for answers. They were not kings or inventors. They were mothers, children, laborers, servants, the poor. For centuries, contaminated water was one of history's most unequal killers. The wealthy were never completely safe, but they usually had choices that others did not. Their homes were built farther from crowded slums. They could afford private wells, cleaner springs, or servants who fetched water from distant sources. When disease spread through a city, the rich often escaped to country estates, while the poor remained behind, trapped by work, family, or simple lack of money. The greatest burden always fell on those who had nowhere else to go. Imagine a working-class woman in Victorian London. Before dawn, she leaves her tiny apartment, carrying 2 heavy wooden buckets. Every day begins with the same journey to the neighborhood pump. The water she collects must last until tomorrow for drinking, cooking, washing clothes, cleaning dishes, and bathing young children. She has no laboratory, no microscope, no way of knowing that a single bucket might contain millions of deadly microorganisms. She is doing everything a responsible mother should do. Yet the very act of caring for her family may be placing them in mortal danger. When cholera struck, mothers often watched helplessly as healthy children became desperately ill within hours. Medical records from the 19th century describe parents carrying limp bodies through crowded streets, searching for doctors who had no cure to offer. Hospitals overflowed, churches filled with grieving families. Entire neighborhoods learned to recognize the dreadful silence that followed when a house stopped opening its front door. Children suffered most. Their smaller bodies lost water at astonishing speed. What began as diarrhea in the morning could become fatal dehydration before nightfall. In many outbreaks, parents survived only to bury several children within the same week. The emotional scars rarely appeared in official records, nor did the economic ones. Every epidemic stole more than lives. Factories lost workers, markets emptied, businesses closed. Farmers struggled to sell food to frightened towns. Merchants avoided infected ports. Trade slowed as rumors traveled faster than ships themselves. Disease became not only a public health crisis, but an economic one, exposing how deeply clean water was connected to prosperity. And the injustice stretched far beyond Europe. In colonies across Asia, Africa, and the Americas, rapidly growing cities often expanded without adequate sanitation for local populations. Safe water systems, where they existed at all, were frequently concentrated in wealthier districts or areas serving colonial administrations, while overcrowded neighborhoods were left with contaminated wells, polluted rivers, or unreliable supplies. The people with the fewest resources consistently faced the greatest risks. It was a pattern that would replace across continents. The poorest drank the most dangerous water. The poorest buried the most children. The poorest were blamed for living in unclean conditions, even though those conditions were often created by governments, landlords, and rapidly expanding cities that failed to build the infrastructure needed to protect them. Long before clean water became a universal expectation, it was a privilege, and that uncomfortable truth has never completely disappeared. John Snow's investigation did not end cholera. Not immediately. Many of his colleagues remained unconvinced. Even after the Broad Street outbreak, the idea that invisible organisms could travel through water sounded more like speculation than science. The medical establishment still clung to the centuries-old belief that disease drifted through poisonous air. What changed their minds was not a single discovery. It was a chain of discoveries that, together, rewrote humanity's understanding of life itself. In the 1860s, the French scientist Louis Pasteur demonstrated that microscopic organisms were responsible for fermentation and spoilage. If tiny living things could turn milk sour and wine bad, perhaps they could also make people sick. A few years later, the German physician Robert Koch identified the specific bacterium responsible for cholera. For the first time in history, humanity could finally see the enemy it had been fighting all along. The implications were staggering. Disease was not a curse. It was not bad luck. It was not foul-smelling air. It was something measurable, traceable, and, most importantly, preventable. Cities around the world began to rethink everything. Engineers, once celebrated for bringing water into cities, now faced an even greater challenge: keeping drinking water completely separate from sewage. Massive underground sewer networks replaced open drains. Filtration plants removed sediment and harmful contaminants before water reached homes. Reservoirs were protected from pollution, while pipes replaced many contaminated wells that had served communities for generations. Perhaps the greatest breakthrough came in the early 20th century with the widespread adoption of chlorination. At first, Many people resisted the idea. Why would anyone intentionally add chemicals to drinking water? Some feared poisoning, others distrusted governments. But the results were undeniable. Communities that treated their water saw deaths from diseases like cholera and typhoid collapse within a generation. Infant mortality fell dramatically. Children who might once have died before their 5th birthday now lived to become parents themselves. The transformation was so successful that many people quickly forgot how revolutionary it truly was. For the first time in human history, millions could turn on a tap and trust what came out. It was one of civilization's quietest miracles. Unlike railroads, skyscrapers, or electric lights, safe drinking water rarely inspired monuments. Tourists do not travel across the world to admire filtration plants or underground sewer tunnels. Yet these invisible systems have saved more lives than countless inventions that receive far greater recognition. And still, the story is not over. According to the World Health Organization and UNICEF, billions of people today still lack safely managed drinking water services, while hundreds of millions rely on sources contaminated by human or animal waste. Climate change, aging infrastructure, pollution, and rapid urban growth continue to threaten water supplies across the globe. The battle that transformed 19th century London has never truly ended. It has simply moved to different places, under different names. Because every civilization, no matter how advanced, remains only one broken water system away from rediscovering a lesson history has taught again and again. Imagine standing once again on Broad Street in London. The crowd is gone. The cries have faded. The pump that once drew desperate families from every corner of the neighborhood is now silent, preserved not as a source of water, but as a reminder of one of history's greatest lessons. The young mother from our story could never have known what was hidden inside the bucket she carried home. She wasn't careless. She wasn't ignorant. She trusted what every human being had trusted for thousands of years: her eyes. And for most of history, that was never enough. Today, you probably have a glass of water within arm's reach. Perhaps it's sitting on your desk. Perhaps it's beside your bed. You poured it without thinking. You didn't inspect it against the light. You didn't wonder whether it carried disease. You didn't ask where it came from, which pipes it traveled through, how many filters cleaned it, or how many scientists, engineers, and workers made it safe before it ever reached your hands. You simply expected it to be safe. That expectation is one of the greatest luxuries in human history. For thousands of generations, drinking water demanded courage as much as thirst. Every river promised life while hiding unseen dangers. Every well carried hope alongside uncertainty. Entire civilizations rose because they found water, yet countless families mourned because they could not protect it. The story of water is not really about rivers or wells. It is about knowledge. It is about the moment humanity finally realized that the greatest threats are not always the ones we can see. That realization reshaped medicine, transformed cities, and quietly added decades to millions of lives. Yet history also leaves us with a warning. Clean water is not a permanent gift. It is a system that must be maintained, protected, and constantly renewed. Pipes age, rivers become polluted, climate shifts, wars destroy infrastructure. Complacency can undo in years what generations struggled to build. The next time you lift a glass of water to your lips, remember this. You are not simply drinking from a tap. You are drinking from thousands of years of trial and error, engineering and discovery, loss and perseverance. And perhaps the clearest water you have ever seen is also one of the greatest achievements humanity has ever made.